Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich, and welcome back to another episode of The Source, a program where we interview policy experts, whistleblowers, former insiders, and journalists to discuss issues often left out of the mainstream media. Today we welcome a special guest, attorney Richard Roth. Richard Roth is the lead attorney suing the CIA and 3 other defendants on behalf of 4 plaintiffs who visited Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. The complaint, which was issued in August of this year, alleges that the 4 plaintiffs' rights under the 4th Amendment were violated. Attorney Richard Roth joins us today to take us through this case and explain to us what is at stake and if this particular lawsuit in the United States could have any impact on the broader extradition proceedings taking place in the UK. Attorney Richard Roth, I want to thank you for joining me today, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Hey, Taylor, thank you for having me.
So this lawsuit against the CIA, Mike Pompeo, UC Global or Undercover Global, and the CEO of UC Global, David Morales, was filed back in August of this year. It is now mid-October. Are there any updates with this case?
So we are, as you know, litigation does generally proceed at a snail's pace. We are in the process of serving both Mike Pompeo and the CIA in the U.S., and we have located UC Global and Mr. Morales. Those are the 4 defendants. And we have not effectuated service, but it's en route.
Can you give us a little bit of a background on this case as far as who the plaintiffs are and what they are suing these 4 defendants for?
Sure. So it's somewhat of a lengthy story. I'll make it very, very simple. Julian Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for, I want to say, probably close to 7 years. During that time period, he was seeking asylum because he was the U.S. wanted to extradite him for what it believed is a criminal conduct, although there was never really a formal indictment issued until the Trump administration. During the 7 years that he was there, he had obviously several visitors. He had friends, he had family, he had doctors, he had journalists, he had lawyers. And what we learned was that in around 2017, that shortly after Mike Pompeo became the director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo essentially had his goal was shutting down Julian Assange. It's a whole other conversation, which I'd love to have with you, as to whether or not Julian Assange did anything wrong. But in connection with that goal, he essentially implemented a series of acts which were, we believe, in violation of the U.S. Constitution. The day that he was sworn in as director of the CIA in April 2017, Pompeo, for some reason in that speech, said that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, the company that he obviously created and is the founder of and is the principal person of, is a non-state hostile intelligence service. So what he did by categorizing, by labeling it in WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence service, it essentially gave him what he believes was the ability to do investigative services and interrogation of WikiLeaks. And in fact, in the same speech, he called Assange a narcissist, a fraud, and a coward. For some reason, he didn't like him. We don't know the background that is. So what happened was, shortly thereafter, he communicated with this company, UC Global, and came up with a scheme to do 2 things that we believe are illegal. One is that when anyone went to visit Julian Assange in the embassy, no matter who it was, you had to hand over your phone, your laptop, your tablet, whatever device you had, which is common, and have them store it. Unbeknownst to everyone there, the MC Global, with the CIA's blessing, essentially took all of the phones and laptops and imaged them. So anything and everything on my phone, if I went in, would be in the possession of the CIA. The second thing they did was they actually set up microphones and cameras in the conference room where Julian Assange was meeting people to essentially gather information about him. The problem with that is, so those are the 2 things he did. There are several problems with that. Number one is that it's an illegal search and seizure. You can't go into, if you're a U.S. citizen, no matter where you are in the world, you cannot go in and just take their property and record them without a search warrant. And they did nothing of the ilk. And what's even worse is that, think about it, lawyers and doctors went into Julian Assange in the embassy. So doctors who were prescribing medicine, who were talking about really confidential things, are in the possession of CIA. Lawyers who have attorney-client communications with Julian and with others on their laptop, that's all in the possession of the CIA. So the lawsuit essentially, with a long-winded answer, the lawsuit essentially is to hold Pompeo and the CIA and their agents liable for wrongfully stealing this information.
At the heart of this case is the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The four plaintiffs are claiming that their Fourth Amendment rights and privileges were violated. For our European viewers who are not too familiar with this amendment, can you explain to us what rights and privileges are asserted in the Fourth Amendment?
Sure. So what the founding fathers of the United States did was they, along with the Constitution, there are several amendments to the Constitution which essentially give individuals rights and privileges. One of them, the Fourth Amendment, essentially protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. So if I'm sitting in my office, the government can't just come in and ransack my office and take things without a process, without a search warrant from a judge. There's no different than them taking my phone if I'm on foreign soil. And it's no different than them listening to conversations I have when I'm at the embassy. So the Constitution protects individuals from getting that improper search and seizure. The way to do it is you go to a judge, you say, Your Honor, I have probable cause that there's a crime being committed, and the judge will either grant or deny the search warrant. So that's essentially the way to do it. So the reason why it's only U.S. plaintiffs is because they are protected, whether it be in the U.S. or elsewhere, from this unreasonable search and seizure that the CIA actually was involved in.
Certainly. Now, of course, there is a separate judicial process taking place in the UK right now where Julian Assange is unfortunately very close to facing extradition to the United States. Home Secretary Priti Patel did approve the extradition order, and now Julian Assange's legal team has submitted its perfected grounds of appeal to the UK High Court. I know that you have received this question before, but I do want to ask you again. How does this case in the United States potentially impact the extradition case?
So I don't think, unfortunately, this will affect it except for public perception. The world is starting to learn that all Julian Assange was a investigative reporter. Remember, the claim against Assange is that he asked for or sought information from people that stole it. What he did is no different than what the New York Times did. Now, in this instance, he was provided this information. He published it. The Pentagon Papers is a perfect example where the New York Times got information which was illegally obtained and published it. But if and when it comes into the possession of the press really should not have any kind of problem. Their whole goal is to get information. There's no difference when the New York Times got Donald Trump's tax returns. That was improperly obtained but delivered to the New York Times. So the point, and CNN and Fox, that's their goal. So he really should not be tried for this alleged violation of the Espionage Act. So what I think this case is doing is it's bringing awareness to people like you who are investigative reporters, to people who are common citizens, to saying, why are they going after a publisher if that's all he did? Now, if he did hack into computers, if they can prove he hacked into computers, I obviously don't have the knowledge, or that he was intimately involved in the stealing of information, then yes, you can't do that. But if all he did was publish, then he shouldn't. And this case is bringing that to the forefront. And people, there's a big undercurrent of not only the press, but of just many, many people, both Democratic and Republican, who are saying, why are you trying Julian Assange if all he was a reporter? So that's, I think, where it's going. I don't think the results of this case will necessarily affect the results of that case, other than what I just said and the fact that the CIA is really acting improperly.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I asked that question is because this information related to the UC Global spying operation, which was really done by the CIA. Of course, UC Global was a private security firm that was contracted by the CIA to do this work and to spy on Julian Assange, his visitors, and others at the embassy. We know that the lower court judge, Vanessa Baratzer, was aware that this took place, and she still did not use that information to block the extradition. Of course, she did eventually rule against extradition, but that was for other reasons, specifically related to Assange's health conditions, and she found that it would be oppressive to extradite Assange to the United States under Section 91 of the UK Extradition Act of 2003. And then also, the UK High Court judges on appeal chose to overturn that ruling of the lower court judge. They also had this information. They knew that this spying operation took place, but it had really no bearing on their decision to show that Julian Assange would not receive a fair trial in the United States. So what do you think could happen here? Do you think that there's a chance that perhaps the UK judiciary could see this case that you have brought forward and maybe think perhaps this man, Julian Assange, will not receive a fair trial in the United States, because that is part of the defense strategy in an extradition case, and that's sort of the stance that they took in the UK?
Yeah. First of all, your knowledge of this is impressive. I mean, you're 100% right on everything you're saying. I don't think it will have an effect because the government is out on a mission. The only reason why it may have an effect is because, think about it, Julian Assange is sitting in the embassy with his criminal counsel preparing a defense to this indictment. Unbeknownst to him, at the same time, the CIA and the the Department of Justice is actually listening to the conversation. So there certainly could be documents excluded. It certainly is a very bad stain on the government to be listening to your adversary and getting information from their playbook. I still think he's going to be indicted. And unfortunately, it's in a very, very tough district in Virginia, a federal district court. But I do believe once he's indicted, I'm hopeful, and I don't think I'm too optimistic, that the groundswell of support will continue to grow. And that's the way that this case and other things out there can help Julian Assange. But if in fact he's just a reporter, then why the heck has he been indicted?
Exactly. You make a really great distinguishment there, and that is that Julian Assange acted as a journalist. He is not a whistleblower, and that's an important point that people need to be aware of. As far as this particular case, there seems to be that there could be challenges with regard to your case. Do you fear that the United States government, or rather the defendants, could invoke state secrets privilege when trying to put forth evidence during discovery, for example?
They're gonna invoke every type of privilege and make every motion they can. They do not want this out, especially when Pompeo, as we understand it, is going to announce he's running for president. So there will be a fight here. Pompeo was subpoenaed, and I should mention there's a parallel case in Spain, in Madrid, which I failed to mention, in which they've gathered a lot of evidence to essentially substantiate the theory that UC Global was hired by the CIA. As I understand it, Pompeo and the CIA, Pompeo in particular, were subpoenaed to produce documents. They refused to do so. So they're hiding the ball in Spain. And what we've learned in Spain is that there are affidavits from individuals who thought they were just gathering information, saying, why am I sending this to Washington, D.C. if he's just in the embassy in London? Why is any of this going? So I think that this is also a stain on the government. I think the government really should not act this way. And again, if in fact he's, like you just said, if he's a publisher, if he's a reporter, then why is he being indicted? The irony is that 2 weeks ago, when Donald Trump received the subpoena for Mar-a-Lago, Rand Paul announced that he believed the Espionage Act, the very act that Assange has been indicted under, should be thrown out, should be vacated. So it's interesting to see where this will play. It's sad because the man sat in an embassy for 6 years, couldn't leave. Now he's in mandatory confinement, or whatever they call it, in London. And if he was just a reporter, it's really, really unfortunate the circumstance he's going through.
It is, and in fact, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, found that Julian Assange has been subjected to psychological torture, and yet this prosecution continues and his confinement and imprisonment continues. So there's definitely a human rights aspect to this case. You mentioned Mike Pompeo, who is one of the defendants in this case, and I understand he is being sued as a private individual. Does that put any additional pressure on him to comply with this court case? Because I do not think that he has complied with the Spanish case.
It doesn't put pressure on him to comply with the Spanish case, but the difference here is that he is a U.S. citizen, and he must. The bottom line is if he does not comply with what a federal court judge says, a judge who was appointed by a president of the United States, we actually have Judge Kodal, who's been a judge for a very long time, then he could be subject to serious contempt proceedings, even imprisonment. So he will have to comply with this case. We're going to have to get over some legal obstacles, but we will do so. We will do so. The evidence here is pretty overwhelming.
I want to talk about the district that this case is being tried in, and that is the U.S. Southern District of New York. Why did you choose this particular district?
We chose it primarily because our plaintiffs reside here. One of our plaintiffs is a woman named Margaret Kunstler, who was the wife of the former very well-known lawyer Kunstler. In any event, he was a lawyer in the Chicago 7 back in the 1960s. He died in the 1990s. But she's a plaintiff. Another woman, Deborah Urbeck, is a plaintiff. She's a New Yorker. And then on top of all that, everything went through New York. Pompeo, when he gave his speech, was in New York. UC Global would send the information to New York as well as Washington. So New York is a nexus for a couple reasons. One is the parties reside here, and two is that a lot of the transactions and occurrences were right in the Southern District of New York.
Just to bring it back to Mike Pompeo briefly, you mentioned the very famous, I guess, well-known speech that he gave, or press conference rather, in 2017. This was right when he was appointed to be the director of the CIA. He gave this speech where he referred to WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence agency. He said some pretty negative remarks about Julian Assange himself. How did this speech influence the attitudes and perceptions of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange among members of the intelligence community? Because we know shortly after that, this spying operation took place. And then also, too, Yahoo News reported that there were serious plans to also assassinate Assange. So how did Pompeo's rhetoric really influence other members of the intelligence community?
Well, so Pompeo at the time ran the CIA, and Pompeo in that same speech said, "We are going to embark on a long-term campaign to shut down WikiLeaks." I've heard of the assassination that was reported in Yahoo News. That is crazy. If the government is actually trying to assassinate somebody, but as far as but that's what Pompeo did. He said we're going to engage in a long-term campaign to shut this non-state hostile intelligence company down, and it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy that he would do this. But he said, I'm going to engage in a long-term pattern. And shortly after that, he met with UC Global in Las Vegas. We have tremendous evidence. This is not conjecture. There's a lot of evidence on here with David Morales, and decided to essentially spy on not only Julian Assange, but on anyone and everyone who went into the Ecuadorian embassy. So it's pretty outrageous that they're doing it. I don't know. What we want is we want it back. We want any documents they got back, and we want damages for the plaintiff. So I think that this, I don't know the reason for it, but there's no question that through all the affidavits we have and all the documents we've obtained, that there was a long-term campaign to essentially shut down Julian Assange.
Wouldn't you say, as a lawyer, that this spying operation constitutes as a violation of attorney-client privilege, as well as doctor-client privilege? I know it's not referred to as that, but your medical records and your meetings with your doctors is meant to be a private environment. That is not what happened for Julian Assange. So is this sufficient to throw the case out of court? Because we know that in the case of Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, it was sufficient to throw his case out of court because his meetings with his psychiatrist were being spied upon, and his case did not go forward. Is there any similarity here?
Yeah, absolutely. It is the doctor-patient privilege, and there's the doctor-patient privilege and the attorney-client privilege. And so anything that they obtained was illegally obtained. You can't take doctor-patient information. You can't take attorney-client information. What's worse, as I said, is they took it from the criminal lawyer who represents Julian in his criminal defense of the government. So we do believe that all of that will be, that a federal court judge is going to be very upset, let me say it mildly, that the U.S. government has been engaged in that conduct. And I believe all of that will come out. All of that will be removed because it's just not something the government should have. Not only that, but think about it. If they went and they imaged Margaret Kunstler's computer and her phone and her laptop when she went in, then not only do they have attorney-client communication with Assange, but they have attorney-client communication with any client she had. So it's outrageous that it was done this way, and we do believe that through the federal processes we can have all of that taken out and returned to the appropriate people.
As a last question, I want to ask you if there is anything else related to this particular lawsuit that is maybe not yet public that you can share with us. Of course, I know you have to keep a lot of information very private to ensure the integrity of the case, but is there anything else you could let us know that maybe isn't public or known yet?
Yeah, right now there's nothing. We do have a mountain of information. There is nothing. We certainly would. I'd love to come back on your show. We'll certainly let you know when anything happens. What we can let you know, as you said, I sort of have to keep my, lips sealed because there's information which I just can't disclose, which is part of our relationship and our going forward investigation. But it just, I will tell you that the 4 plaintiffs are the tip of the iceberg, that there are hundreds of people that went into that embassy. And we've received communications from several of them who have said they want to join in the lawsuit. Now, if they're not U.S. citizens, they can't join in, but we could very well add different people to this lawsuit because what was done here, as I said, was just remarkable, and it's just not the way the U.S. government should act.
Certainly, and I look forward to having you back to discuss any updates that you may have on this case. Attorney Richard Roth, thank you.
Thank you, Taylor.
And I want to thank all of you for watching this video. Please be sure to share it on your social media. And while you're at it, please make sure that you are subscribed to acTVism Munich's YouTube and Rumble channels, and check us out on Telegram at acTVism Munich Official. Also, please remember that acTVism Munich is a fully independent organization. We do not take any corporate or governmental money, so please be sure to donate so we can continue with our independent news and analysis. I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich, and I'll see you all next time.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me. I am so pleased to be here speaking about what not only I consider to be the greatest threat to press freedom, but what also many civil liberties organizations, human rights organizations, and press freedom organizations consider to be the greatest threat to press freedom, and that is the prosecution of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. This case is extraordinary. Here we have an award-winning Australian journalist who is facing 175 years in a maximum security prison in the United States because he published information in the public interest, and he published the truth. I will do a quick overview here. Is the presentation available? You don't have one? Okay, I'll just keep going here. I'll do a brief case overview. Julian Assange is, of course, the founder of WikiLeaks. He founded this organization in 2006, and WikiLeaks really shaped the way that people viewed media in general. This was namely because of the technology that was used and the very secure Dropbox that allowed for whistleblowers to securely and anonymously provide classified material to WikiLeaks, and even WikiLeaks staff members would not know who was providing this information, and then also to the funding model. Here we hear a lot about independent journalism. Well, that all started with WikiLeaks because they created this idea that you can fund a media organization from donations and from the public. WikiLeaks has published numerous documents, of course, exposing US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan that really shaped people's perspective on these wars. human rights abuses, including torture programs in Guantanamo Bay, and also unlawful CIA spying on innocent citizens through Vault 7. And this journalism, this work, won Julian Assange numerous awards. So this is a very important point that I want you all to remember, and that is that the journalism that won Julian Assange numerous awards is the same journalism that has him in a prison today. He is in Belmarsh Prison in England, which is a maximum security prison, and it houses some of the most notorious, dangerous, and violent criminals in England. That is where a journalist is sitting right now. It's absolutely shameful. And just to bring you back to what had happened on April 11th, 2019, of course, Julian Assange was arrested, charged with 17 counts related to espionage, one related to computer intrusion. The espionage charges are related to the receipt and publication of classified material. And I'll continue on here with the persecution of Julian Assange. So as a result of doing this work, we all know many people suffer from disinformation campaigns and targeting campaigns against them. And eventually, Julian Assange had no choice but to enter the Ecuadorian embassy in London in June 2012 to seek asylum there. Unfortunately, he spent 7 years in this embassy as an asylum seeker. During this time, he lacked proper medical care, access to sunlight, proper time with his family. He was confined to a very small room, of course, unable to leave the embassy. And these conditions were considered to be torturous conditions after UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, examined Assange and determined that that was taking place and that he was exhibiting symptoms of torture. So this is someone who has suffered extraordinarily as of this point. And of course, WikiLeaks was still operating throughout this time. And then this is what brings me to when the persecution really started to increase and become very vicious. And it's interesting to note the timeline here. In 2017, WikiLeaks made an announcement that they were going to release information related to CIA spying, and this eventually became the greatest CIA leak in history. And shortly after that, the US intelligence services, we believe that to be the CIA, contracted the embassy's security firm. Oftentimes embassies have security firms. This one did, and it was Undercover Global, UC Global. The job of this company was to protect Julian Assange, to protect the people who worked at the embassy and also the visitors. But instead, US intelligence invited the CEO of this company to re-network and rewire the security system into a surveillance system to gather information on Assange, all of his contacts, even his attorneys. His attorney-client privilege was being violated. The privacy of his friends, his family members, himself was being violated, and the case is still moving forward. So again, visitors had to provide the embassy employees with their devices. They had their data taken from them against their will, without their knowledge, and then this was sent to US intelligence services. And some of the very grotesque things that happened as a part of this surveillance operation is that there was a camera placed into the women's bathroom, and even the DNA of Assange's infant son was taken from a diaper. That is how depraved these individuals are and what they did to a journalist who deeply embarrassed the US government and the intelligence apparatus. And lastly, I will point out as well that the CIA, in fact, plotted to assassinate Assange. Many of you may be looking at me like, okay, this is maybe a step too far. Come on, you're just speculating. They wouldn't possibly do that, or how could you really prove that? Well, the reality is we had 30 former US officials who went to Yahoo News and revealed this, that yes, in fact, there were serious plans to kidnap and assassinate Assange while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Fortunately, this plan did not come to fruition, but there were serious plans to kill this individual, to assassinate him. And think about this. The UK recently just approved the extradition order. How could it be that the UK government approved the extradition of a man to a country whose intelligence agencies conspired to assassinate him? That is the state of our media right now. That is the state of the Western Empire, the Western intelligence agencies in Western countries, in particular, the United States government and the UK government working in cahoots and together. I will go through the prosecution here quickly. In 2018, there was an indictment filed against Assange. Again, this came after Vault 7. Likely, this could have been a retaliation for the Vault 7 publications, but the government of the United States sought to basically criminalize his work, in particular exposing U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, and this was the information that was provided by whistleblower Chelsea Manning. Assange was then, of course, arrested April 11th, 2019. Extradition hearings took place in London in February of 2020, in October of 2020. I covered these extensively, listened in on all of the court hearings. And then a few months later, on January 4th, 2021, a magistrate's court issued a decision on extradition, and it was stunning. We were very happy with this decision. The judge actually rejected the extradition order on grounds that it would be oppressive to extradite Assange under Section 91 of the UK Extradition Act of 2003. This was due to the fact that Julian Assange is suffering from Asperger's, and it would be oppressive to extradite him to the United States. Then the Crown Prosecution Service, which is representing the US government, appealed this decision, and the Crown Prosecution Service won the case on appeal, and then UK Home Secretary Priti Patel eventually approved the extradition order, and now Assange's legal team has filed its perfected grounds on appeal, and now it is up to the high court judges to make a decision on extradition. And I think that you can gather from what I just said that this has been somewhat of an abusive process, and also it is oftentimes that the process itself is the punishment. Now, what happens if Assange is extradited to the United States? Unfortunately, we learned a lot of very disturbing information about what could happen to him if extradited throughout the extradition hearings. He would likely be tried in the Eastern District Court of Virginia, where no national security defendant has ever won a case there. Let me repeat that. No national security defendant has ever won a case in this court. The majority of the jury pool would be made up of ex-intelligence, their family members, and their friends. The case would also not be public, and press would not have access to cover this case because it is a national security case, and CIPA regulations would be put into effect. And as a national security defendant, Assange himself would also likely be placed under SAMs, or special administrative measures. He would be housed in a specific unit, isolated from the public. This is actually beyond just a solitary confinement. This is something much more strict, and his access to his attorneys, his ability to prepare his case would be seriously hindered, and it would not be a situation in which he would be able to effectively and properly prepare his defense with his attorneys. In fact, one of the defense witnesses, Yancey Ellis, who is an attorney and often represents people who are housed in this particular unit at this prison, and that is the Alexandria Detention Center, this person had stated that when he speaks with his clients in this unit, they have to scream at each other because of the steel doors prevent them from having a normal conversation. So that is the level of interference we have when someone in this position is trying to prepare a case. So the point here to take away is that Julian Assange will not at all receive a fair trial in the United States if extradited. And if convicted, he is likely to be held in ADX Florence or another maximum security prison. ADX Florence in Colorado houses some of the country's most notorious criminals and offenders, like Ted Kaczynski, the Boston Marathon bombers, all of those type of criminal offenders. And again, this is where the United States government would like to place an award-winning journalist and publisher, because he embarrassed the United States and exposed intelligence corruption. And also, too, because he's being charged under the Espionage Act, he would not be able to provide a public interest defense. And just here is a visual of the prison conditions that he would be subjected to. You could see the cell, again, 3 by 5 meters by 2, that's 7 feet by 12 feet, so not the best of conditions, of course, and also he would be held in his cell for 22, 23 hours a day and limited access to the outside world. And also for many of the doctors here, I wanted to make note of this, that Julian Assange, unfortunately, is also a torture victim. I alluded to this earlier. And if you are concerned about Julian Assange's health, as many doctors are, you can join Doctors for Assange by visiting doctorsforassange.org, and you can sign the petitions, become involved, and help make a difference in this case. Now, some of you may be wondering, okay, but why should I care? I'm not a journalist. I'm not necessarily an activist. This case doesn't really impact me. Well, it certainly does, because this case has an impact on the public's right to know and the public's right to access information. The Assange case criminalizes standard and normal journalistic activity that journalists engage in every single day, specifically related to source protection and news gathering techniques. The Assange case also sets a global precedent that empowers governments to extradite foreign citizens for political purposes. And lastly, the Assange case is a threat to the First Amendment, which has become the global standard for press freedom. Again, to reiterate what I had said earlier, this is an attack on access to information. We have had a tremendous attack on access to information also when it comes to COVID-19 and a number of other subjects. We see immense amounts of censorship. And again, this case is very important. Assange's fate is inherently tied to your fate, and again, your ability to access the truth. Because without access to truthful and accurate information, we cannot fight for a better future. We cannot fight for anything. Because without access to the truth, we cannot understand and we cannot confront the real issues that are ahead of us and that need to be addressed. And of course, I need to close here with ways on how to help, because this case is not over. Assange is not extradited to the United States. He is still in Belmarsh prison under horrible conditions. This situation is dire, not only for the broader press implications that are there, but also his general well-being and health. So I encourage you to please act, and I made this font intentionally very large so you could all take pictures with your phone, and that you'll go home and you'll remember to take action, visit these websites, attend these events. And this is a little bit more information about myself. I am a journalist with acTVism Munich. Many of you may be pleased here to know that my Assange reporting is also translated into the German language. I'm very proud to work for acTVism Munich. We are a nonprofit independent news organization based in Germany, and we publish in English and German. I also report for thelastamericanvagabond.com. I'm active on Twitter and Telegram, but if you would like to stay up to date with my work, you can there. And lastly, if there is time, I have a very special message from Christine Assange, which is the mother of Julian Assange. I thank her for allowing me to share this message with you all. Many of you in here are parents, you are mothers. You can relate to Christine. She is a mother, and at the end of the day, we all must remember that Julian Assange is a human being. He is a son, he is a father, a brother, a friend, and he is suffering tremendously. And those around him who love him are also suffering tremendously. And I just would like you all to hear a message from Christine, because I think there is no better person who can advocate for you than your own mother. And I wanted to end off on this note. And I thank you all very much for listening to this presentation. It's been my pleasure to speak to you about this case. And if you could just take 2 minutes to hear this plea, it should be embedded into the PowerPoint. Thank you all very much.
Today, on the back of the UK government's decision to extradite Julian to the United States, I respectfully make my plea directly to the parties involved, including US President Joe Biden, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and the lead solicitor of Julian's UK legal team, Gareth Pearce. After 11.5 years in pre-trial detention, and with legal proceedings dragging on with no end in sight, it has become clear to all following that this case is political and requires a diplomatic solution. When people become very invested in winning at all costs, the collateral damage is truth, justice, and humanity. I implore all sides to take a step back from the heat of the fight for a moment and to reflect. I ask all sides to consider a diplomatic solution. Negotiating an end to conflict is a normal part of civilised existence, within a marriage, the boardroom, long-running legal cases, and disputes between nation-states. In the spirit of bringing this to an end, both sides will need to give a little. Julian has been detained long enough to satisfy any needs for revenge from those pursuing prosecution. He has suffered enough to satisfy those wishing to make him a symbol for press freedom. I beseech those who say that his needs as a suffering human being first, and I have faith that with goodwill on both sides, a resolution can be reached. Thank you for hearing my plea.
Award-winning publisher and journalist Julian Assange faces a possible 175-year prison sentence in the United States for publishing information in the public interest through WikiLeaks. The journalism that won Julian Assange numerous awards is the same journalism that has him in a prison today. Despite a UK judge blocking the US extradition request, Assange is still in Belmarsh prison awaiting a court date for the US appeal.
It's just heartbreaking to see, your loved one just locked in a prison sort of indefinitely without any sort of, any sort of sentence or time when they can be released.
But with the new U.S. administration, Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, and father, John Shipton, are hopeful that the prosecution of Julian Assange will end. John and Gabriel are touring the United States, speaking to supporters and encouraging the Biden administration to support the First Amendment and especially the free press. It's called the Home Run for Julian Tour, and the Shiptons are on a mission to bring their family member, Julian Assange, home.
John and I are travelling across the US. We're doing a total of, 17 stops.
John and Gabriel are taking the free Assange message to the cities of Denver, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, Washington, D.C., and others, including Columbus, Ohio. This is the most consequential press freedom case of the modern era. The continued prosecution of Julian Assange is America's betrayal of what it claims to value most, its First Amendment. Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich, and today we just wrapped up the Home Run for Julian event in Columbus, Ohio, outside the State House. And joining me today is Julian Assange's father, John Shipton, and Julian Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, who are touring the United States to bring awareness to this case, which threatens free speech and free press around the world. I want to thank both of you for joining me today.
A pleasure, a real pleasure.
John, I will start with you. Can you tell me what motivated you to tour the United States?
Back in the Christmas time, Gabrielle and I were chatting as to what to do next. We'd just done a tour of northern New South Wales and southern Victoria, southern Queensland, and we were thinking, well, what is the best thing to do? And it was President-elect Biden's period where he was gathering together his team, and so we thought that it would be appropriate time to go to the United States and see if, before things firmed in one direction or another, to see if we could influence the direction they would go in. So we came to the United States. We stayed here for 3 weeks. We had some communication with the Biden team pre the inauguration, and then upon that decided to come back after Gabriel managed to organise Who to See and a series of events.
Gabriel, can you tell me what your experience has been thus far in the U.S.?
It's been incredible, really. I'm going to say this wherever we go. I'm always amazed at the turnout, amazed at the support. We're meeting, very, powerful figures every day, popular personalities all the time who are coming on board to support Julian. Since we started in Miami probably, almost 2 weeks ago now, and the media has been building. We had to increase the capacity 3 times for that event. Washington, D.C. event yesterday was a capacity event. So it's just, the outpouring of support for Julian and people who are wanting to just express their interest in their democratic rights and their free press rights and their First Amendment rights is just very it's inspiring.
So John, what has it been like to see this overwhelming amount of support for your son?
Well, it's worldwide. The first one to point out it was a global problem was James Goodall, who was back in the Pentagon Papers day, the solicitor or lawyer, I think you call it in America, lawyer for the New York Times. He firmly pointed out that what was Julian's persecution amounted to a global problem for the West. In every country, comment by journalists and the preparation of analysis by journalists and publications would be intimidated and oppressed, which has turned out to be correct. No journalist wants to face the sort of persecution that Julian has had for publishing leaks on national security matters or doing analysis on national security matters. No journalist wants to be oppressed and intimidated and persecuted and psychologically tortured and arbitrarily detained for 13 years. So the quality of comment and the courage required to make that comment has consequently declined.
When Julian's free, it gives us an opportunity to understand that it's our strength that brought about Julian's freedom. And similarly,
while this is an international issue, of course, why should Americans in particular care about this case?
This is the first time the Espionage Act has ever been used against a publisher. So I think we saw in the beginning of February those 24 press freedom and human rights organisations. They sent a letter to the DOJ saying that this case is very concerning for press freedoms in this country. So what this case means is that press freedoms all around, the ability to people to report, to find out about what their government is doing in their names is just being constricted, reduced, and things that go on in a lot of what's going on is happening behind closed doors. So it's important for the people in the US to stand up for their democratic rights and their freedom, because without actually knowing what's being done in their names, then they're not truly free.
And what about you, John? Why should Americans who maybe aren't so knowledgeable on this case be paying attention and be very concerned?
It's a good question. The answers, of course, are general and not specific to each American, but to Americans. They have a vibrant culture here, which in the 60s and 70s and 80s produced a way of being and a way of living that most of the Western world adopted, so that the culture of casual dressing, open plan living, the design of houses, the style of housing, the style of dressing, the style of address were all generated out of the United States in that period. And this only came about because the quality in the United States of vibrant discussion and ferment between groups of people and academics, and the general life of the United States is a one where people converse with each other to get to an understanding. There can be no freedom at all anywhere without knowledge, and these conversations that people have depend upon knowledge. And if there's the conversation without knowledge, then we just bathe ourselves in further ignorance. And you can see that emerging in the United States now as people break up into groups, and they're furious with each other and refuse to have discussions with each other and refuse to embark upon understanding the point of view of each other. So consequently, 200 cities over the last 18 months had riots and people burning shops and cars and so on. This is not a good circumstance. So that's one reason why the conversation between people ought to be knowledgeable. Actually, in a country like the United States, in my view, where the dynamism and the exuberance is continuous, it's vital for the people to have knowledgeable conversations for each other. For it's a very difficult country to govern otherwise.
I think it's very important to talk about the broader press implications here, but it's also important for people to realize that Julian Assange is a human being. You are his brother, Gabriel. What has it been like to see your brother go through this experience and be prosecuted by the United States for publishing, of all things?
I think, I can, it's, at times, I guess, I can talk about when I went to see him in 2019. He was just, he'd been in the prison in Belmarsh for not so long. He was in the health ward there. He was on suicide watch, and at that time when I went to see him, that was very, very hard. I'd never seen Julian in a state like that before, even during all his time in the embassy, and it was really heartbreaking. As to see someone who I've looked up to, who I have so much respect for, and has been so supportive to me to be in in that sort of state where I thought that I might never see him again. So I think in that way there are those moments when it's really hard, but there's also I feel a lot of I'm very proud of the work that Julian's done as well, and I think is sort of so unique and one of a kind that I feel a deep sense of I am just very proud of my brother, basically.
Absolutely. WikiLeaks has really shaped the way we talk about media. And John, you must be very proud of your son's accomplishments and contributions to journalism.
Yes, of course, for sure. What I particularly like in Julian's contribution is the composition that he came up with, a wiki that is available to everybody. Anybody could go along, look at what was their area of curiosity, and make analysis, and as a consequence become more knowledgeable. To repeat myself, there is no freedom without knowledge. And this, as a wiki, enabled a worldwide forum wherever there is a computer that can go online and look at some of the WikiLeaks publications. Could go online, look at the publication, and with their friends and by themselves form a view founded upon actual documents. This is vital. This is magical, because at that time when it first started, there were 60 million people who could go online and do analysis. And now, of course, there's many more. And so this feature enables us to become knowledgeable contributors to the polity, to assist and insist upon participation in shaping policy and formulating policies that governments and states and corporations enact.
While we're on the subject of WikiLeaks as an entity, Gabriel, can you speak about how WikiLeaks has been censored over the years?
It suffered an extra-legal financial blockade in 2010 after it published, the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, the Guantanamo Bay files. So there was an attempted censoring, through a financial blockade, by by Visa, MasterCard, stopped processing donations. PayPal, they had their PayPal closed down. A lot of Julian's bank accounts were closed down. They also, I think their DNS server was taken off, or they were taken down from their Dyna.DNS server. So that those are ways that it's been censored over the years, but it's still going. So he really saw the internet and the capability of the internet to be an emancipatory tool, that would make us all more free, through knowledge. Whereas a lot of the other, technologists these days who sort of developed around that same time, the things that they created are now, sort of tools of surveillance and control.
So both of you are here in the United States. You are going to be touring the entire country. Gabriel, can you tell me what you are seeking to accomplish while you're here?
I think, there are support groups right across the US. So, we're coming to sort of coalesce those groups, give them, just help support them. I mean, they've been out here, doing stuff, some of them for years and years. I mean, in Boston, they've been doing one every second week for years, and it's just to come and support them, help how we can with their actions, connect them to the other groups so that they can coordinate together and, really have a push and focus about this sort of opportune time that we have now with this new administration, this new DOJ.
Merrick Garland is speaking to the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN today, about the DOJ and how they've been using subpoenas against journalists to find out sources and things like that. So, what we've been asking people to do is to get up in the comments of the New York Post and the the New York Times and the Washington Post, and just let them know that you care about, what's happening to Julian Assange and that the Espionage Act is being used against a publisher, and that they should be bringing that up with Merrick Garland as well.
So I would like to hear from both of you on this, but what is your message to Americans, and especially those who may not be too familiar with this case?
I think as we go around the country, we are asking people to, just act locally, talk to their neighbours and friends, tell them, help educate people about Julian's case, put together local petitions to take to their Congress people as constituents of a localised area, form groups, form Facebook groups, do all these sort of localised, sort of grassroots style things. That's what we're sort of encouraging people to do as we move across. For those people who are new or are interested in the case, we sort of we point them towards the letter from the 24 Press Freedom and Human Rights groups, and just try and explain why Julian's case is not just about Julian, but it's really about their freedoms and their democratic rights.
And John, what is your final message to the viewers right now?
Well, join us. It's a noble task. There's no downside. It's all upside. So to begin repairing that first act, send Julian home to his family.
Well, I want to thank both of you for joining me today, and I wish you the best of luck on your travels throughout the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. And I want to thank you guys for watching. If you are in the United States, please attend one of the Home Run for Julian events. You heard it from both Julian Assange's father, John Shipton, and Julian Assange's brother, Gabriel Shipton, that they would love to see you at one of these events, so please be sure to be there. I want to thank you guys again for watching. I'm independent journalist Taylor Hudak, and I'll see you next time.
So without further ado, everybody, Taylor Hudak.
All right, Andrew, I want to thank you for that introduction, and I also want to thank the Shiptons for being here. John Shipton, it is good to see you again, and Gabriel, thank you for also being here, and a big thank you to Action for Assange for hosting this event. Woo! Excellent work they're doing. live streams every single week for hours covering this case and speaking about the importance of this case. It's also something that obviously is very important to me, and I spent quite a bit of time covering it. And I want to begin, first of all, by reiterating a point that WikiLeaks editor-in-chief Christian Rafferson mentioned. This was on the day before the first part of the extradition hearings, and he said that whatever one's passion is or cause is, the outcome of this case will impact your ability to fight for what means so much to you, whether that be privacy rights, anti-surveillance, censorship, animal rights, gay rights, whatever your cause is. Julian Assange's situation, his fate, is inherently tied to your fate as well. And if you're not an activist, if you're not a journalist, if you're just a member of the public who is concerned about how the United States engages with the rest of the world, and you're curious about politics, this case impacts your right to know. An attack on Julian Assange is an attack on all of us. Now, covering this case in London extensively, it is no secret that there has been numerous challenges to covering the case, whether NGO observers whose professional job it is to monitor these court proceedings and were unable to the journalists like myself who had some difficulty connecting to the video conference link. This is the most consequential press freedom case of our time. It is in the public interest to learn about these proceedings and hear about what's happening in this courtroom. We also must ask ourselves why this is happening. Why are we keeping this case in the dark? Why has the media largely remained silent? Fortunately, because of groups like Action for Assange and other grassroots journalists, more and more people in the mainstream media, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, among other publications, are stepping up and they're speaking out and saying enough is enough. This is wrong. This is an attack on all journalists. So it's not just a fringe group of activists anymore. That is not at all the case. Every single major civil liberties organization in the United States and throughout the world is calling for Julian Assange to be freed and for this case to be dropped. The journalism that won Julian Assange numerous awards is the same journalism that has him in a prison today. He is in one of the worst prisons, if not the worst prison in England right now. And I want to reiterate right now, especially to the Biden administration, that each day that Julian Assange is sitting in Belmarsh prison, and each day that the United States, this country, continues to prosecute this case, is another day that the United States betrays its own Constitution. How can we allow this? Does this make any sense? No, it doesn't, right? And lastly, at the end of the second half of the extradition proceedings, I spoke with Lori Love, who is one of the very few people who can understand what Julian Assange is going through as far as facing extradition to the United States. And Lori Love said something to me that was very profound. He said that oftentimes it is the process can be the punishment. This process is a punishment, and we're seeing that happen right now, especially with the judge's latest decision back earlier in winter where she denied his bail. Absolutely devastating decision, but one thing that we all have to remember is that, I want to end off first of all with a message from Edward Snowden. I said this a few months ago, but I think it's really important to keep remembering this. And I think all of us here who are activists and journalists, especially independent journalists, know this, but we cannot rely on elected leaders to solve our problems. And while I am going to call upon the Biden administration to separate itself from Trump-era attacks on the free press by dropping this case and freeing Assange, we must all depend on each other as well, because real change begins with me. It begins with all of you here. It begins with the organizers of this event. It begins with everyone who is fighting for this case and who cares about the future of the free press. Another thing too here is that this is not just a broader press issue or First Amendment issue. This is someone's life, and I think that's why it's important to have these events, to have Julian Assange's family here, so we know this is a real person who is being impacted by this. Niels Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, said that he has been subjected to torture for a decade. This is completely unacceptable, and the UK government, the US, Ecuador, and Sweden have not been held accountable for this. Julian Assange ought to be freed, and he also ought to be compensated for the horrific state crimes that have been leveled against him. If we constantly raise awareness and collectively act together like we are today, we can impact Julian Assange's tomorrow. We can save free speech and free press around the world, and we can save the life of Julian Assange. Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich, and welcome back to another Julian Assange case update. I'm in London outside the Old Bailey Courthouse, and joining me to speak about today's court proceedings is journalist and head of investigation with Declassified UK, Matt Kennard. Matt, thank you for speaking with me. Now, before we get into your investigative journalism, I just wanted your perspective on what took place in court today.
Yeah, I think first it's worth mentioning the conditions within which this hearing is being held. Now, this is my first day here at the Old Bailey, and I got into the public gallery because a nice activist allowed me to take their place. They'd been queuing since early in the morning. And you're not allowed to take your phone or your computer in, i.e. there's no place to even store them, so you have to give it to an activist outside. You have to go up 6 flights of stairs. You sit in a empty courtroom, except for a few journalists at the bottom, but we're in the viewing gallery. And to look at a screen which is kind of like 20 foot away from you, with air vents just pumping out cold air, so you're freezing cold. It felt, I mean, shocking, to be honest with you, because I had heard reports about how difficult it was to access this case, but sitting in the public gallery, I was shocked that this is in one of the, maybe the most important press freedom case in history. This is the conditions within which people who want to see it have to sit, and I mean, the whole point about justice is it has to be seen to be done. So we should have a transparent process around the case, but it doesn't seem to be happening. In terms of what I saw today, it was about Assange's mental health again, and the risk of suicide if he is extradited to the United States. And I think that it's quite clear there's a consensus that he has had thoughts of suicide for a long time, and as the final witness said, it's always related to extradition to the United States. She said he was always said to her, if I'm extradited to the United States, I will commit suicide. So I mean, there's no two ways about that in that sense. And as usual, the prosecution, the US prosecution lawyer Mark Lewis, his tactic is just to impugn the reputation and the expertise of the witness rather than actually try and get any information out. Now, I don't think that's a very effective way to go about the case, because the evidence is so clearly in Assange's favour. But as I've said before, in this case, we don't know, because although I'm optimistic about the fact that what's happening in the courtroom is really showing the political nature of the case and the risk to Assange, we aren't aware of the context of the British legal system and what's going on in the US as well. And there are forces at play that we don't know about. I won't speculate because I don't want to be conspiratorial, but there are definitely, this case has been from the start irregular when you put it in the context of other normal criminal cases.
Now, many are wondering if Assange is actually receiving a fair hearing. You have done a number of investigations specifically on this judge, Judge Vanessa Baratzer, as well as Lady Arbuthnot. Can you speak to your work with that?
Yeah, so we looked initially at the history and the network of Lady Arbuthnot, who's Westminster Chief Magistrate, who's the most senior judge in Westminster. And she oversees her junior judges, including Vanessa Baratzer. And she actually ruled on the case. She made 2 key rulings in February 2018, which upheld his bail violation conviction, which the lawyers were trying to get taken away because then it would be easier to negotiate safe passage to Ecuador. So she's been a player previously in terms of actual rulings in the courtroom, but is still a player because she oversees her junior judges, including Baratzer. And she is deeply embedded in terms of her family links to the British military establishment and also the US military and intelligence establishment. So the first story we did was about her husband, who's Lord Arbuthnot, a former Conservative defence minister, who was a director of a company alongside the ex-head of MI6, Sir John Scarlett. He's been closely working with the Henry Jackson Society. That was another story we did, which is a neoconservative group which has for a decade been briefing against WikiLeaks and Assange in the media. That was the first story. We also looked at her son, who is works for an investment house that has invested heavily in something called Darktrace, which was a cybersecurity company, which is basically to stop data leaks, which was set up by GCHQ, the UK surveillance agency, and MI5, the domestic security agency, and then recruited personnel directly from the CIA and NSA. I mean, these stories had no impact, and in fact, we did 6 recently, and then every single time I requested comment from Westminster Magistrates Court and the Ministry of Justice, never got anything back. The final one we did recently, which was about the Henry Jackson Society, which I just referenced, we finally got a one-line comment from them saying, Lady Arbuthnot has not shown any evidence of bias, which didn't really answer my questions, but at least it was some sort of response. Now, in that context, you kind of wonder when this is known about and nothing's been done about it, or there's not even any public acknowledgement or official acknowledgement that it exists. You wonder what other conflicts of interest exist, and the fact is we don't have a press in this country that is looking into this case like it should be. I think if you had basically declassified and a work myself and Mark Curtis have done on this, we're kind of the only journalists looking at the legal process around it, which is really mad when you think of the level of conflict of interest there is and the importance of the case. So yeah, as I say, I don't know how this is going to play out, but Baresa herself is an example of the lack of transparency around the case, because the story we did about her was I applied to the Ministry of Justice through the Freedom of Information Act for a basic information about her. I wanted a case list, so every case she's ruled on and what the ruling was. Nothing particularly detailed. And the Ministry of Justice rejected it and said it violated the Constitutional Reform Act as well as data protection. I did the same request for a different judge who was appointed a magistrate on the same day as her, and they didn't reject it. So that tells you something. And then I did a parallel construction whereby I just used open source stuff to construct an extradition case list for her. I found 24 cases through Westlaw, which is a legal database, as well as Factiva, the media database. 24 cases, 23 of which she'd ordered extradition. So she's got a 96% extradition record based on publicly available information. So it doesn't look good when you think about that. And the work we've done has basically been ignored by the mainstream media, number one, and then obviously officials themselves, number two. But if the mainstream media became interested in the stories we're doing, and as I say, did investigations themselves, I think it could really change the game with this case. Because Ellsberg testified the other day, as we know, in the Pentagon Papers case, the government malfeasance, in that case, they raided his psychologist office to try and get information to smear him in the media. That got the case thrown out. Now, if we can find out information which clearly shows that this case is corrupted in some sense, it would have a major impact, and especially if it appears in the mainstream media, because I think even if the stories we've done had appeared in, say, The Guardian or The Times, it would have had a big national impact and maybe have changed things. But I think that it's because they don't see Assange as a journalist. They don't see what's happening to him as a threat to them. And of course it is, because he's in prison, and the extradition is happening because he revealed information which is embarrassing to the US government. Now, that if he gets extradited, that gives license to the US government to go anywhere in the world and pluck someone that because they don't like what they're publishing about them, and put them in prison in a supermax. And that is terrifying. I mean, I know it's an overused word, but I think it is one step on the way towards fascism. And of course, it's been done by the Trump administration as well. And it's funny that all the resistance Democrats who get upset about him being mean to reporters, which is fair enough, he's got an awful record on the media, it doesn't transpose over to Assange, when in fact, what he's doing to Assange and his administration and his DOJ is doing to Assange is the most grave threat to press freedom in history, because it will set a precedent that they can use against anyone.
You're exactly right. Now, has the previous judge in this case, Lady Arbuthnot, has she formally recused herself in this case?
That's a good question, and the answer is no. What she did, and it's all, as I say, being completely untransparent. Basically, 6 months ago or so, Westminster Magistrates Court released a statement to Private Eye magazine saying that she had stepped aside on the case, i.e. she wasn't ruling on it anymore. We did know at that point she wasn't ruling, but we'd never got official acknowledgement. But that was the first official acknowledgement, and it was only got because a reporter requested it. And then since that, as I say, they haven't responded to any of my requests. And in fact, it's an important distinction, because if she recused herself, which is an official admission of conflict of interest, one, it would mean that the defence could revisit the ruling she made in 2018, which I mentioned. And also it would completely change her role in the case now, because just stepping aside allows her to maintain her mentoring and liaising role that she has with her junior judges, with Baresa on this case, which obviously we don't know anything about what their relationship on this case is, but there's no reason that it can't still exist. She just can't rule on it. So the difference between recusement and stepping aside is huge and has massive ramifications. And of course, if you look at the evidence, and we've compiled thousands of words of it, she 100% has huge conflicts of interest across the board that means she should recuse herself. But it hasn't happened. And it really is, like so much of this case, a stain on the British judiciary. And when history is written, it's going to be an embarrassing moment in the British judicial history, even if they don't extradite him. The whole record is just abysmal.
Now, as an investigative journalist yourself, how will the outcome of this case impact your work?
I think that a free, vibrant press is a cornerstone of democracy. So we can't let the powers that be undermine that central tenet of democracy by threatening people. And of course, this case is a threat to everyone. But we will carry on doing what we're doing. Of course, for many journalists, who don't have that predilection, it will soften what they do, because people, a lot of this case is about Assange's interactions with Chelsea Manning, and he is being extradited for basically helping her protect her identity, which is what, as a journalist, you have a responsibility to help your source protect themselves from the powers that they're upsetting by releasing the information to you. And so all sorts of source interaction for journalists will change after this, or people will have to think about it in a very different way, because it will criminalize effectively the reporting of national security issues, because especially in the US, or around the world, but when you're dealing with US agencies. And a good example is we published recently a really good investigation about the CIA and MI6, their secret war in Kenya, which became a big issue in Kenya. It was published on, got 2 front pages in one of the main papers in Kenya. And in fact, if Assange gets extradited, that article contained things that essentially the CIA didn't like, that were classified, which means that they could bring a case against that journalist just for publishing information they don't like if Assange gets extradited. So, I mean, so much is riding on this, and it should send chills through any investigative journalist around the world, because if they get Assange, then they can get anyone.
Okay, Matt Kennard, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich. The past few weeks, we have been covering Julian Assange's extradition hearings. For journalists covering this case, it has become apparent that this entire process is very difficult for the WikiLeaks founder. However, very few people can actually fully understand what Assange is going through. Joining me now is computer scientist and activist Lori Love. Lori is one of the few people who can fully understand what Assange is experiencing, as Lori has gone through this process himself and has successfully fought extradition from the UK to the US. Lori, I want to thank you for joining me, and I want to begin by asking you, where are we at in this moment in time regarding Julian Assange's case?
So it's quite a long process, which is not great if you're being detained in horrific conditions during that process, but this is kind of near the start, if you can believe that. So you have the initial hearing at Westminster Magistrates Court. There'll be a ruling by the district judge, and whichever way it goes, it will probably be appealed, and then it will be settled at the High Court, Court of Appeals, and potentially then go on to the Supreme Court. So if it was a journey, I'd say we're maybe sort of getting to 1/3 of the way through, or possibly 1/2 of the way through.
If you have been following these hearings the past few weeks, can you just tell me your general impression of what took place in the court?
I mean, shambolic is too generous. Kafkaesque is almost doesn't fully capture just how deeply cynical and torturous it has been in many respects. So just to outline, a major problem has been the inaccessibility to observers to the press and to international monitors who are there from various non-governmental institutions and representatives from the European Parliament, representatives from organisations concerned with press freedoms, who have obviously taken great interest in this case because it's of such monumental importance to a free press and therefore to democracy, who have been systematically denied access because of the small size of the courtroom, because of the issues with social distancing due to the coronavirus. However, through technology, it should have been possible for as many people as want to observe and participate through observation in this hearing to do so, and they've been denied. So there have been up to 40 organisations who have wanted to monitor this case, and there's been immense frustration at their inability to get in. That's just one of the issues. There's been problems with the technology to have witnesses, and there have been so many expert witnesses. There's so much important information that is relevant and germane to this hearing to do with the background and history of WikiLeaks, what the publisher has actually revealed to the world in terms of very serious misdeeds, war crimes, and the relevance that's had to the world, and also important testimony regarding the horrific conditions in detention in the United States and the process. And there's been difficulty of those witnesses being able to give that evidence in full because of technology and because of the prosecutors and the judge trying to limit what can be entered into the public record. And those are just a few. I could give many more examples.
So I also want to touch on WikiLeaks publications, their significance, as well as WikiLeaks core values. Can you speak to that and why it's so important that we have organizations that are publishing crucial and vital information that needs to be made public?
So the important thing is to remember the framing and the context. So WikiLeaks came into the forefront, into the public stage during the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, which were, let's be honest with ourselves, voluntary wars of aggression by the United States, not necessary for the defence of the United States, as part of the supposed war on terror, which has led to the destabilisation of the Middle East, millions of deaths, and an ongoing situation that's going to be very difficult to resolve. And the problem was that these wars were only possible because the systematic co-option of the mainstream media to the imperialist war machine that made it palatable to the public to go to war in Iraq. And we saw this in the UK, we saw it with the sexed up dossier, all of the papers saying Saddam Hussein could launch missiles in 45 minutes that could hit the UK, all lies. It turned out in retrospect that the weapons of mass destruction. WikiLeaks' core principle was to use a technical term, disintermediate the facts from the people, and in colloquial terms that means cutting out the middleman, cutting out the editorialization and the filtering and the media slant and the bias that allowed these mainstream media organizations to create the conditions for these horrific wars. And the way to do that was to give the public access to vetted, verified, original source documentation, so materials of truth, and to not selectively publish them, to not put an editorial slant on them, to not present them with a spin, but to allow the public to see the truth and come to their own conclusions. And this was through, and that's in the name, WikiLeaks, is to create a system whereby brave people, whistleblowers who have access to these materials that have immense relevance to the public could safely get them to the organisation WikiLeaks, who could then publish them and make them available. And this has had a huge impact, and the main thing people will remember is the collateral murder video, and this is footage from a war helicopter in Afghanistan, and you could see members of the US Department of Defense military opening fire with Hellfire missiles on what turned out to be journalists and civilians, and 2 Reuters journalists were killed. And no one would have known had it not been for a brave whistleblower accessing those files and using WikiLeaks to publish them. At the same time, there was the war logs, as they were called, which is information collected about the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq that revealed the true extent of civilian casualties that were being covered up by the press, that people didn't understand. And suddenly the world, the public, got a real image of how these wars were being perpetrated and prosecuted, and that changed the tide and helped the anti-war movement. Similarly, WikiLeaks revealed information about the atrocities in Guantanamo Bay, where the United States was extra-legally holding what they called enemy combatants and systematically torturing them out with the rule of law outside of the Geneva Conventions. And it was only through publication by WikiLeaks of information about that some of these atrocities were able to be stopped by lawyers and human rights activists. And so I'd say it's impossible to overstate the impact that WikiLeaks as a model of transparency in journalism has had on the world. And what we're seeing through this vendetta, I would call it, by that same machine that whose war crimes and whose injustices were revealed against WikiLeaks and against Julian Assange as the sort of person representing this courageous truth-telling initiative, is so ferocious because people who want to control the world, who want to have wars of aggression, have wars for resources, to destabilise sovereign governments, want to do that with impunity and do not want the public to be involved, because that takes away their ability to do so.
Do you think that this is the United States retaliating against Julian Assange for publishing very embarrassing information?
100%. And all you have to do is use your imagination and change it from the United States to any other regime. So say if it was a regime somewhere in Africa or somewhere in the Middle East and they had committed atrocities and war crimes, and a journalist, a publisher, had revealed that to the world, and a legal judicial process was set up to render that publisher to the regime that had committed those atrocities so that they could be punished, and so that a chilling effect, so that a deterrence could be made to stop such things happening in the future, the whole world would be up in arms against it. But yet somehow the United States and the UK have this strange myopia, this strange ability to pretend that this is somehow not terrible. We wouldn't countenance it if it was any other place, but somehow the UK judicial system is seriously considering sending the person who spoke the truth about terrible things to be punished by the people who did those terrible things.
Can you speak about the UK justice system and its fairness or lack of fairness?
Yes, I can. It's a mixed bag. The fact that I'm here today alive and somewhat free and able to speak to you is because the system did work in my case, that we successfully fought against and won and prevented an extradition request from the United States. And I want people to know just how rare this is, that the treaty that was signed in the wake of the Iraq War by the government of George W. Bush and the government of Tony Blair, the partners in the destruction of the Middle East, was incredibly one-sided. It's the only extradition treaty that does not require from the requesting country a minimum standard of evidence, what's called a prima facie case, enough to convince a regular person that there is a case to be answered. That requirement was taken away. No other country has that privilege. It was all done to make it incredibly easy for the United States to extradite people from the UK, supposedly to fight the war on terror. And they're almost always successful. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's in the 90s. So if you pick a random person and try to extradite them 9 out of 10 times, they're going to go there. And this is done on the assumption that there will be a fair trial on the other side, and that's why we don't have to contest the evidence. But as someone who's sat through this process, and picture yourself, one day the police come knocking on your door, they take you to London, you go to Westminster Magistrates Court, you're told that you're going to be extradited, you sit and you hope that you'll make bail. In my case, that required a bond of £5,000 and the surrender of my passports, and I was able to go home only on the condition that I go to the police station initially every day to answer bail, and that made it just about possible to campaign and organise and to work with my defence. Julian hasn't been afforded that privilege. He is in Belmarsh prison. his access to lawyers, his ability to see evidence is severely curtailed, his mental and physical health is deteriorating. So that, again, speaks to the difficulty of this process. Yeah, so the assumption is that you'll get to the United States and you'll get a fair trial, but you don't really, you cannot really imagine that's going to happen, because in the United States federal criminal justice system, around 97% of people do not actually get their day in court because they take what's called a plea bargain. And the plea bargaining system is called coercive, which means that they are effectively strong-armed, bullied into doing so, because the charges levied can be so ridiculous. In my case, it was 99 years, so effectively the rest of my life. Julian's case, it's over 100 years, 140 years. And they say, we will lay all of these charges on you. You will have a stacked deck. You will be in the Eastern District of Virginia, where the people on the jury will be part of the military-industrial complex simply because of the economical labour system around that place. And you can take this risk of spending the rest of your life in horrific conditions where you might die because of the deterioration of your physical and mental health, or you forsake your right to a fair trial and you take the plea bargain, and 97 people out of 100 do that. So there is no meaningful hope that there will be a fair trial, and yet claims can be made in the extradition hearing that cannot be contested on the basis of evidence. So the whole thing is Kafkaesque. Okay. But the hope is that it gets to a higher court where the process is a bit fairer, and we can talk more about that.
Okay, Lori Love, thank you. Now, in the second segment to this three-part series and exclusive interview with Lori Love, we will discuss the history of his case, his fight for freedom, as well as WikiLeaks and others' role in helping make that happen. I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich, and thank you all for watching. Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich, and welcome back to part 2 of this three-part series and exclusive interview with Lori Love. We are now going to be focusing on your case, Lori, and your fight for freedom. And you, of course, have been through this process already. And you once did say, quote, "The process itself can become the punishment," end quote. Can you expand on what you meant by that?
Sure. Well, we tend to use verbs like a fight for freedom or a battle against extradition, and it's not a coincidence that these analogies are made, because it is somewhat like a physical battle, and it's had a physical effect on my body. And you say you've got the scars to prove it. You can look at my face today. I have a severe chronic inflammatory syndrome that's been exacerbated and rendered to this extreme level because of the stress of a 5-year process in which I had to daily consider that I would be taken to a country that I've never been to, that I haven't had the potential of breaking a law in because I've never been there, and be separated from my friends and family by 2,000 miles, and very realistically spend the rest of my life locked in a small concrete cell with terrible conditions, potentially segregated, put on a form of solitary confinement because of poor mental health or special administrative measures, where I'd be, have no human contact, no ability to socialise, no meaningful care from medical professionals, and for me, the prospect was a slow, torturous death. That is the only way of phrasing it. And the result of having to think about this prospect daily is that it takes a toll on you, on your health, and you can see it in myself, physically and mentally. It was a daily battle, and I'm still carrying the burden of that, and it will take years to heal. And we see that in Julian. And for me, I had the luxury, as I said, of being granted bail, of having some limited freedom and capacity to organise and work with the defence team and campaign, and to try and build the best possible campaign. Julian has not any of those freedoms. He is already living the threat that he has on the other end of the process. He is already getting to deal with that on a daily basis by being in Belmarsh. And Belmarsh is not a great prison. I know quite a lot about the prison system in the UK because both my parents work in the prison system, and I'm an activist for prison abolition and prison reform in the UK and the United States, and things here are not great. In this average prison in the UK, things are definitely not great in Belmarsh, but even that is a walk in the park compared to how atrocious the conditions are in the United States. And so the reason I call it, the reason I use the phrase punishment by process is the United States doesn't have to, or any persecutor using these tactics does not necessarily have to have a strong enough case to be right to win in a fair trial under the rule of law. They can grind people down through the judicial process itself, through how long it takes. For me, it was 5 years. For Julian, he has been arbitrarily, unlawfully detained for over 10 years now in various guises. The United Kingdom not upholding recognised principles of international law and diplomatic relations to allow him to get to Ecuador, and then him being betrayed by a new government that was brought in and therefore pulled out of the embassy in an unprecedented violation of sovereignty, and then being denied bail and sent to prison for what should not really be an offence that results in detention, which is breaching bail, because political asylum should supersede bail under international law. So these dirty tricks have been played, and the toll already takes its effect, and it is enough. You have to put yourself in the position of a journalist who's coming up in the world of media today, who might potentially have a source approach them and say, I work for a department or an agency of a government or a contractor or some private organisation that is working with them, and I have knowledge of atrocities, of injustices, of war crimes, and I would like you to publish them, protect me as a source. And that journalist looks to Julian Assange in a cell, facing the rest of his life under torturous conditions in a horrific US prison system, and has to undertake the calculus of risk and say, do I do what's right, what my heart says, what my principles are, what journalism is supposed to do, which is to speak truth to power, or do I save myself from the risk of being crushed by that very system? And unfortunately, courage is sometimes in short supply in this world, and so the chilling effect that this case is already having is probably huge. And if it is successful, if Julian is extradited, if he goes through some sort of show trial in the United States and that seals his fate, then it is going to be a lot harder for people in the press to do what is right. And so that's why it is so important that we speak up against this, and that we are rightly disgusted and at the abhorrency that allows someone's life to be made so difficult without being found guilty of committing any crime. Just in my case, I've not even been charged with a crime in the UK, but I've had a decade of my life effectively taken, my health and my prospects severely limited, and stress, not just to me, but my friends and family, has been immense. And I won, but I wouldn't say that it was like, greatest victory in the world. So I still can't leave the country without fear of being kidnapped. And so, we really need to be cognizant of the fact that these powerful forces can make it very difficult, and we have to actually stand up against that and agitate for a system where people who are courageous enough to publish the truth, and we cannot turn against the truth, especially when it comes to such important things as wars and atrocities and detention of people outside of the rule of law. We need to fight for a system where we do have a free press. Without a free press, we do not really have a meaningful prospect for a free society and democracy.
Julian Assange has publicly lauded you and defended you, as you have done the same for him. Can you speak about the nature of your relationship?
Sure. So I was inspired, as many people were, by WikiLeaks. It lifted the veil, shall we say, and as I said earlier, and people started to see the truth. And it also was so inspiring because it allow people to see the power that they have, the power that the internet has, as a transformative way of breaking through these systems of institutionalized media that have been co-opted by the power base, to make the people the media, to cut out the middleman, to allow anyone to become a whistleblower, to become a truth teller if they have access to source documents, and to empower the public to see the truth directly, unmediated, unvetted, unslanted, unspun. And that was very inspiring to me as a young person with, aspirations to principles and conscientiousness, to get into activism. I have to give my thanks to the people in WikiLeaks and the broader community of people, activists for internet freedoms. The reason that I was able to successfully fight the case is that I had the support of the Courage Foundation. And the Courage Foundation was set up by associates of WikiLeaks, and Julian played a large role in that and was on the board for the Courage Foundation. And it came out of the race to save Edward Snowden, who another whistleblower and truth teller that revealed things to the public about what was being done in terms of unlawful surveillance by the National Security Agency and the broader Five Eyes intelligence cartel. And in order to try and get him somewhere safe, there was a campaign started and funds were raised, and that turned into the Courage Foundation, which seeks to protect truth tellers, whistleblowers, and hackers being included in that as people who can help organisations have access to the truth. And it was only through their support and campaigning that was able to mount a successful defence. So I owe a debt of gratitude to Julian and WikiLeaks for helping that.
Now, what actions that were taken really made a difference in your case?
So, in theory, the judicial process is sort of independent and happens in a world of its own and is not beholden to public opinion and things like that. In the real world, what happens when the public takes an interest, when people are informed about an important case, when there is successful interfacing with the press so that people can get a good picture and understanding of what's going on and how important it is, when support is raised and a large number of people come out and say we do not want this terrible thing to happen. Notable in my case, for example, the Courage Foundation helped organise a letter signed by lots of members of Parliament on all sides of the political spectrum, raising their concerns specifically about the conditions in the United States. And I don't like to talk about this because it's morbid, but to put a fine point on it, the prospect that I would die, that I would commit suicide because I cannot bear to live in a small box for the rest of my life in a country that I don't know, that I've never been to, for allegedly trying to make the world a better place. And the same is for Julian. And when people see that and people are rightly concerned, then that changes the playing field, it changes the calculus, and that does inform the judges. The way I would phrase it is it facilitates them to do the right thing against the pressure from the United States, from the power to relinquish and to do what's wanted. And so it is vital that things happen like we're doing today, that we help the public understand that everyone has a role in this. It's not just a spectator sport, it's not just something that happens that is outside of your control, that anyone can attend, can agitate, can inform their friends and family, can write letters to people in power, can turn up in court, can sign petitions, that people need to understand that they can exercise a will to power in the interests of justice and help in the greater struggle. And Julian is just, I shouldn't say just, but Julian is, let's say, a symbol for something greater. So it's a human, personal struggle, and it would be a personal tragedy if he was extradited, but is representative of something much broader and something much greater, which is the ongoing and endless need for the public to fight for a free press. It's something we can't take for granted, and so you've got to remember that you can be a part of this, and you should.
So with regard to your case, Julian Assange once said, quote, "Lori Love is fighting this case for the rights of all UK residents against excessive and abusive policing," end quote. Can you speak about the similarities between your case and Assange's current extradition case at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are striking parallels, and one of the things that really kept me going through this long and torturous process was the hope and the faith that something good would come out of it, and that turned out to be the case when we won, that it set a precedent that somebody cannot be arbitrarily snatched from the UK and rendered up to the United States tragically broken system of justice without there being sufficient evidence and there being consideration of their human rights and their ability to seek to have adequate care in that system, and that's what I was fighting for. You know, obviously I wanted to save my own life, but I wanted to make it less possible that this could happen to another person, and to build up through precedent a viable defence against this horrendous extradition process. And we won on two different grounds. One was the forum bar, which is about the appropriate venue for charges to be considered on the basis of jurisdiction. The fact that Julian is in the UK and has never been to the United States could not have committed crimes there, similarly for myself. We won on another grounds, and that it was found by the court to be literally unjust and oppressive to send somebody with medical and physical conditions into a detention system that could not provide adequate care, where those conditions would deteriorate, where they would face what is tantamount on expert opinion to torture, which is extended solitary confinement. And so I knew when I was going through this that it was not just for myself, that I was drawing some sort of line and saying, you know, thus far you shall go and no further to the United States in its efforts to be the world police, and its efforts to extend its arm of the law to cover the whole world, which no other country has been so arrogant as to assume to do. And so it is my fervent hope that this precedent will give the judges what they need to prevent this extradition. And so for that, it's the only reason that I could say honestly that I would go through this again, because I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but I feel that it was worthwhile because we need to live in a system that is multilateral, that is not unipolar, where one country has this control and this ability to strong-arm other legal jurisdictions. We need to have meaningful sovereignty and independence of other countries and their systems of law.
Okay, Lori Love, thank you. In the third and final segment of this three-part series and exclusive interview with Lori Love, we will be discussing the future and what we can expect if we successfully free Julian Assange. I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich, and I'll see you all next time. Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Hudak with acTVism Munich, and welcome back to part 3 of the exclusive series and interview with Lori Love. Lori, I wanted to get your opinion on what we can expect for the future in the Assange case, and especially if he is set free.
So that's the outcome that we're all hoping and aiming and striving for, is that Julian will not be extradited, that he will be, the extradition process will find again that it is unjust and oppressive, or some other grounds that for him not to be taken to the United States, and the horrific conditions that would await him there, and he will be freed after so much unlawful detention, 10 years, and that he will be given safe passage, I think, back to Australia, which is his home country. And he will be able to continue to live and work, either in WikiLeaks or in some other capacity, and that WikiLeaks will continue to operate, and WikiLeaks is continuing to operate, and it's not dependent on one person, but still we cannot have this one person being persecuted and oppressed to set an example that nobody else be so courageous. And so the future, as I imagine it, is we have this initial judgment that is coming on January the 4th, and I'm not too optimistic that that will go the right way. The important thing is the evidence has been entered into the record, and that at a higher court with, shall we say, more independence of thought and conscience will, on appeal, rule that Julian should not be extradited. And the alternative prospect is unfortunately barbaric, and so we have to keep imagining and picturing, not just passively but actively working towards an outcome where Julian secures his freedom, we secure his freedom, and not just this positive outcome for one person, but the principle and the precedent that sets, that the free press is inviolable, that there is not some line beyond which you cannot go when standing up to power. That just as with the Pentagon Papers, just as with other historical cases where truth has been spoken to power and the public has benefited from transparency, and an effort has been made to oppress and persecute those that were involved in that they will not be successful, and will continue to have a free press in this time when it has never been more important to have one.
So on January 4th, 2021, as you said, the judge is going to make a decision, and there's two possible outcomes: that she either grants extradition or does not grant extradition. Can you take us through your vision of what those outcomes would look like?
Sure. So having been through the process myself, I sat and awaited after the quite difficult hearings at Westminster Magistrate Court the outcome, and I had to sit, as Julian will have to sit, in the dock and listen to the verdict, and a very small time has been allotted for the reading of that verdict. It's usually read in full, the judgment, and even shorter time has been allocated for Julian's than for mine, and unfortunately that is not an optimistic signal. And I don't want to be too judgmental of the judge. I don't want to use phrases such as bent or crooked. I will just use a metaphor, and that is, it's very hard to walk the right path when you're in the pocket of someone else, and that is what Westminster Magistrates Court historically has been. It is in the pocket of institutional power, and so we can expect, unfortunately, I'm open to the potentiality that the right thing happens at this case, but we have to be realistic and expect that on January the 4th, the ruling will be that the extradition can proceed. It then goes to the Home Secretary, who in theory can exercise independence to stop the process on the grounds of human rights. Unfortunately, the government made this a lot harder after the case of Gary McKinnon, so the prospect of a threat to Julian's human rights is specifically disallowed as a reason for the extradition not to proceed at the Home Secretary stage. So it will probably be waved through and rubber stamped. At that point, it's open to appeal, and the defence will appeal to the higher court, to the High Court. It then goes, as in my case, to the Royal Courts of Justice, and there I would say the second half, the more important battle in terms of jurisprudence and justice will happen, and we will then continue fighting at that stage.
So you're exactly right, and it's really important that people continue to support him during these next few months and beyond that. Now, you once did say that, quote, "The only way to improve is to continue to fight for truth tellers. There's no better example, in my opinion, of a truth teller in our current era than Julian Assange," end quote. Can you expand further on what you meant?
Sure. I'll use a story. Story of the Emperor's New Clothes, which probably most people know, that there was an emperor who was tricked by some some cheeky people. He wanted the greatest garment in the world, and they spun one, and they kept asking for gold, and they spun this garment supposedly, but he couldn't see it. But they said, it can only be seen by the wise and the clever, and if you're stupid, you'll not be able to see it. And he went out on a parade, and everyone else was told the same story, and everyone didn't want to seem like the stupid person who couldn't see the clothes, so they all played along, and they all went along with the charade of the Emperor's New Clothes. And it just took one person, one child, who didn't buy into this false consciousness to start laughing, and suddenly the illusion was shattered. And it's the same with truth in an age of media deception, in an age of false consciousness, where we close our eyes to the atrocities that happen in war, and we all play along as if it's okay, as if it doesn't affect us. It only takes some courageous people to break that illusion by showing us the reality, the grim and stark reality that we saw in the collateral murder videos, that we saw in the logs that showed the scale of the civilian casualties, that we saw in the documentation of the horrific atrocities at Guantanamo, to shatter that illusion, for people to be confronted with that reality and to face their own consciousness and their own role that we all play in this world. Governments do not act independently. Governments, although they can contradict the public, although they can act against the public will, they can only exist with the tacit support of the governed. And so we do play a role in whether there is justice or injustice, whether there is truth or whether there is falsehood and lies and cover-ups. And the way we do that is by not allowing ourselves to be passive observers, but by being active participants, by putting pressure on the government, and by saying, in the words of an activist from the 60s, there comes a point when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you cannot allow it to participate, you cannot watch it participate, but you have to put your body on the gears and on the levers, and to say that the machine will not be allowed to operate at all. And that's the stage that we're at, is that people need to rise up vocally, to attend in person, to participate and to say no. We demand to be able to live in a world where the public has access to truth, where things are not done in our name with money that people pay in taxes, to what is, let's be realistic, a military-industrial complex that has taken over the US federal government and has allowed it to become an imperial hegemon that has caused instability in the world in the interests of profit, in the interests of power. The only way that we can imagine a future where we transition to a multipolar world, where we have meaningful international discussions instead of a small group of people strong-arming the process of international justice. The only way we can have that is by fighting for organisations that enable the truth to be told, such as WikiLeaks, in my opinion, the prime stellar example of empowering people with the truth. And ironically, it's written in the lobby of an institution that, let's say, has not done very much to improve the world, the CIA. A quote from the Bible, and it is, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And so if we believe in freedom, then it is incumbent upon us, it is our responsibility, our solemn and grave responsibility, to fight for it. And at the moment, the best way that many people can in this country and around the world fight for freedom is to support WikiLeaks, to support Julian Assange, and to stop the powerful from suppressing and gagging the truth, which is the only thing in the end that can hold them to account.
Lori, you have a unique but rare perspective since you have been through what Julian Assange is currently going through at this time. Can you leave everyone off with a final message?
Sure. I am living testament today, by being here, by being alive, by being free, by being able to talk to you, that it is possible to face overwhelming odds, to face a stacked deck, a system that presupposes that the powerful will get their way, and with not just myself, but with the support of people who might be watching, like yourselves, with the support of organisations, with the support of campaigners, the support of the morals and the conscience of the wider public, to stand up to that power and to win. And seldom has that happened, and it had its cost, but at the end of the day we were victorious, and I hope and have faith and will keep fighting for that victory to happen in Julian Assange's case. And so we do not have the luxury of being pessimistic, we do not have the luxury of falling into cynicism. We must have faith and optimism that the right thing will happen, not by itself, but that we fight for it. In the Latin phrase that fiat justitia ruat coelum, that let right be done, though the heavens fall, and together we can do that.
Lori Love, thank you.
These are the building blocks that make up our organization and the goals we would like to achieve. In order to continue our journalism and realize these values fundamental to our democracy, we need 1,000 supporters in our crowdfunding campaign, donating only €5 or dollars per month via Patreon or bank account. Right now, we have only 200 supporters and are not able to take the next step. Our future is in your hands. Strengthen independent journalism and be part of meaningful change.